Redemption, Texas, 1881. The wooden church doors slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the dusty streets like a gunshot. 22-year-old Grace Catherine Morrison stood on the front steps, her 3-month-old daughter Emma crying in her arms, while the congregation's whispers died behind the closed doors. The man she'd called father for 22 years, Reverend Samuel Morrison, had just declared her dead to him, dead to God, and dead to the only community she'd ever known. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. You are no daughter of mine. His voice still rang in her ears, cold as winter steel. Take your sin and leave this holy place. Never darken these doors again. Grace shifted Emma to her other arm, the baby's cries growing more desperate in the koshin. Oppressive August heat. Her simple cotton dress, once pristine white, now bore the stains of travel and tears. The small cloth bag containing her few possessions, a change of clothes, her mother's Bible, and the last of her savings, $7.32, felt impossibly heavy in her trembling hand. Behind her, the church that had been her entire world for 22 years stood like a monument to her shame. Every Sunday morning, every Wednesday evening, every church social and revival meeting, all of it had been her life until 3 months ago, when she'd returned from her supposed visit to her aunt in San Antonio, carrying more than just memories. Truth was far more complicated than the congregation knew. There had been no aunt in San Antonio. There had been James Hartwell, the traveling preacher who'd arrived in Redemption the previous spring with his silver tongue and promises of marriage. He'd courted her properly, or so she'd thought, speaking of building a ministry together, of serving God as husband and wife. Her father had approved, seeing in James a worthy successor to his own pulpit. But James Hartwell had possessed a wandering spirit that matched his wandering hands. When Grace had tearfully confessed her condition, expecting joy and plans for a hasty but respectable wedding, James had simply disappeared in the night, leaving behind only a note about being called to minister in California and a promise to send for her when the Lord provided. That had been 6 months ago. No word had come from California or anywhere else. Grace had hidden her condition as long as possible, letting out her dresses, avoiding close contact with the church ladies who might notice the changes. When concealment became impossible, she'd concocted the story about helping her ailing aunt in San Antonio, a woman who existed only in Grace's desperate imagination. She'd used her small savings to rent a room in a boarding house 3 towns over, where she'd lived in isolation, working as a seamstress to pay for her keep and prepare for the baby's arrival. Emma had been born on a cold February morning with only a tired midwife and Grace's own prayers for company. The baby was perfect: 10 tiny fingers, 10 perfect toes, and lungs that worked magnificently. Grace had named her Emma after her own mother, dead these past 5 years. The only person who might have shown mercy in this situation, but money had run out quickly. The boarding house demanded payment she couldn't provide. The seamstress work barely covered food, let alone rent and medical care. With nowhere else to turn, Grace had swallowed her pride and returned to Redemption, hoping against hope that her father's Christian charity might extend to his own daughter and grandchild. She'd been devastatingly wrong. The confrontation had been swift and brutal. Reverend Morrison had taken one look at the baby, his face transforming from confusion to horror to righteous fury. He'd demanded to know who the father was, and when Grace had tearfully confessed about James Hartwell, her father's rage had doubled. "That snake, that devil in preacher's clothing," he'd roared. "But that doesn't excuse your sin, Grace. You should have resisted temptation. You should have remained pure." The church board had been summoned immediately. Grace had found herself standing before 12 men who'd known her since birth, men who'd watched her grow up in the church pews, who'd praised her Sunday school teaching and her charitable work with the poor. Now they looked at her with cold judgment, their faces carved from stone. "The wages of sin is death," her father had intoned, his voice carrying the weight of divine authority. "Spiritually you are dead. To us, you have brought shame upon this church, upon my ministry, upon the name of Morrison. You cannot remain here." No one had spoken in her defense. Not Mrs. Killingsworth, who'd been like a grandmother to her. Not Thomas Fletcher, who'd courted her before James arrived and had seemed genuinely fond of her. Not even her father's own sister, Aunt Martha, who'd helped raise Grace after her mother's death. They'd given her 1 hour to collect her belongings and leave town. 1 hour to abandon the only life she'd ever known. Now, standing in the merciless heat with Emma screaming in her arms, Grace faced the complete destruction of everything she'd believed about family, forgiveness, and Christian love. The irony wasn't lost on her. The church that preached redemption had offered none to one of their own. The main street of redemption stretched before her like a gauntlet. Word of her disgrace had spread quickly through the small town. Shopkeepers emerged from their stores to stare. Women pulled their children closer and whispered behind gloved hands. Men tipped their hats but avoided her eyes, their faces a mixture of pity and disapproval. Grace walked with as much dignity as she could muster, her head high despite the burning shame in her chest. Emma's cries had subsided to exhausted whimpers. The baby's small face red from the heat and distress. Grace's own throat felt parched, her lips cracked from the dry August air, but she wouldn't give the town the satisfaction of seeing her beg for water. At the general store, she paused, hoping to purchase supplies for whatever journey lay ahead. The owner, Mr. Brennan, had been kind to her family for years, extending credit during lean times, always ensuring the Morrison household had what they needed. "I'd like to buy some food," Grace said quietly, approaching the counter. "For traveling." Brennan looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting away from her face. "I'm sorry, Miss Morrison, but I can't serve you. Reverend's orders says anyone who helps you is enabling sin." The words hit like physical blows. Her father's influence extended beyond the church walls, apparently. The man who'd preached about love and forgiveness had systematically cut off every avenue of assistance for his own daughter. "Please," Grace whispered, her composure finally cracking. "I have money. I just need food for my baby." Brennan's face softened slightly, but he shook his head. "I can't go against the Reverend. I'm sorry, truly I am, but I can't risk my standing in this community." Grace backed away from the counter, clutching Emma tighter. $7.32 wouldn't last long, especially if no one would sell her anything. The nearest town was Millfield, 20 miles east through dangerous territory known for cattle rustlers and worse. She had no horse, no wagon, no protection except her own determination. As she stepped back onto the street, the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly. Emma began crying again, hungry and uncomfortable. Grace's own stomach gnawed with emptiness. She hadn't eaten since the previous evening, too nervous about the confrontation with her father to manage breakfast. The stagecoach to Millfield wouldn't arrive until Thursday, 2 days away. The hotel would never rent her a room, not with her father's prohibition hanging over her head. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, and a baby depending entirely on her ability to survive. Panic began to set in as the reality of her situation crystallized. She was completely alone in a world that had no place for fallen women. The society that had shaped her entire understanding of right and wrong had cast her out without mercy or second chances. Every door was closed, every face turned away, every hand withdrawn. At the edge of town, where the road forked toward Millfield and parts unknown, Grace finally stopped walking. Her legs trembled with exhaustion and fear. Emma had cried herself to sleep, her small body limp with heat and hunger. Grace's own strength was nearly spent, but she couldn't rest here, so close to the town that had rejected her. She needed to find shelter, water, some way to feed her baby and herself. Looking back toward redemption, she could see the church steeple rising above the other buildings, its white paint gleaming in the afternoon sun. For 22 years, that steeple had represented everything good and holy in her world. Now it looked like a monument to hypocrisy, a symbol of conditional love that evaporated the moment it was truly tested. Grace turned away from the town that had been her home and began walking east toward the unknown. Each step took her further from everything familiar, deeper into a world she'd been taught to fear. But what choice did she have? Stay and starve, or venture into the wilderness and hope for some kind of miracle? The road stretched ahead, dusty and seemingly endless. On either side, scrub brush and mesquite trees offered little shade. In the distance, she could see mountains rising like purple shadows against the horizon. Somewhere out there lay her future, whatever form it might take. Emma stirred in her arms, making soft sounds that tugged at Grace's heart. This innocent child deserved better than a mother who'd lost everything through one mistake. She deserved a home, security, love from more than just one desperate woman walking an empty road. "I'm sorry, sweet girl," Grace whispered to her daughter. "I'm so sorry. This is the life I can give you." But even as she spoke the words, something hardened inside Grace Morrison. The church had taught her to be meek, submissive, dependent on others for guidance and protection. Those lessons had served her poorly when tested by real hardship. Perhaps it was time to learn different lessons about strength, self-reliance, and the kind of love that didn't come with impossible conditions. She adjusted Emma in her arms and continued walking, her shadow stretching long across the dusty road. Behind her lay the death of everything she'd been. Ahead lay the possibility of becoming someone entirely new if she could survive long enough to discover who that might be. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Night would fall soon, bringing its own dangers and challenges. Grace quickened her pace, searching the landscape for any sign of shelter, any hope of sanctuary in a world that had shown her none. As redemption disappeared behind her, Grace Morrison took her first steps toward a future she couldn't imagine, one that would test every belief she'd held about strength, love, and what it truly meant to find redemption in the most unexpected places. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The abandoned Line shack appeared like a mirage against the darkening Texas sky. Grace had been walking for 3 hours, her feet blistered inside her Sunday shoes, Emma growing heavier with each step. The small wooden structure, weathered gray by wind and sun, sat in a grove of cottonwood trees beside a narrow creek. It wasn't much. 4 walls, a sagging roof, and a door hanging askew on rusty hinges, but it was shelter. Grace pushed through the door, disturbing a family of mice that scurried into the shadows. The interior smelled of dust and abandonment, but it was blessedly cooler than the open road. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney intact despite the building's obvious neglect. A few pieces of broken furniture scattered the floor, remnants of whoever had last called this place home. Emma began crying again, her small fists flailing with hunger and discomfort. Grace's own body ached with emptiness, but the baby's needs came first. She settled onto a relatively clean patch of floor and began to nurse, grateful for this most basic ability to provide for her child. As Emma fed, Grace surveyed her temporary sanctuary. Moonlight filtered through gaps in the roof, illuminating cobwebs and mouse droppings, but also revealing possibilities. The walls were solid, the door could be secured, and the creek outside promised fresh water. It wasn't the comfortable parsonage where she'd grown up, but it was hers, perhaps the first place she'd ever been able to claim without permission or judgment. Her first night alone in the wilderness passed in fitful sleep, interrupted by strange sounds, owls calling, Coyotes howling in the distance, the rustle of small creatures in the walls. Every noise made her start, clutching Emma closer. The sheltered preacher's daughter had never spent a night outside the protective walls of civilization. Now she was. Learning that darkness held terrors she'd never imagined, dawn brought new challenges. Emma's diaper needed changing, but Grace had only 2 cloth squares and no way to properly clean them. Her own hunger had intensified overnight, becoming an annoying pain that made it difficult to concentrate. The $7 in her bag might as well have been 7 pennies, worthless without a store willing to serve her. The creek provided her. First small victory. The water ran clear and cold, offering relief for her parched throat and swollen feet. She managed to rinse Emma's soiled diaper, though without soap it remained far from truly clean. Small accomplishments, but in her desperate situation, each success felt monumental. On her second day, Grace discovered she wasn't entirely alone in this wilderness. Fresh horse tracks in the mud by the creek indicated riders had passed recently, several of them, judging by the number of prints. The thought of strangers in this isolated place both terrified and intrigued her. Were they travelers like herself, or something more dangerous? Her answer came that afternoon when 3 men approached the line shack on horseback. Grace peered through a gap in the wall, her heart hammering as she studied the newcomers. They wore dusty trail clothes and carried weapons with the casual ease of men accustomed to violence. The leader, a tall man with dark hair and calculating eyes, dismounted and examined the tracks she'd unwittingly left around the building. "Someone's been here," he called to his companions. "Fresh sign, probably still inside." Grace clutched Emma to her chest, praying the baby wouldn't cry and give them away. But Emma chose that moment to let out a wail that echoed through the thin walls like a dinner bell. "Well, I'll be damned," one of the men laughed. "Sounds like we got ourselves a woman and a baby holed up in there." The door creaked open, and Grace found herself face to face with the dark-haired leader. His eyes took in her disheveled appearance, the crying baby, the obvious desperation of her situation. For a moment, neither spoke. "Ma'am," he said finally, touching the brim of his hat with surprising courtesy. "Didn't expect to find anyone out here, especially not a lady with a child." Grace struggled to find her voice. These men could be anything: outlaws, drifters, worse. But they were also the first humans she'd encountered who weren't actively rejecting her presence. "I'm sorry," she managed. "I didn't know this belonged to anyone. I was just seeking shelter." The man studied her more closely, taking in her torn dress, her obvious exhaustion. "You running from something, ma'am, or to something?" The question hit closer to truth than she was prepared to share. "I'm traveling to Millfield," she said carefully. "My transportation arrangements fell through." It was technically true, though it omitted the crucial details of her disgrace and exile. The man's knowing look suggested he recognized the careful editing in her words. "Name's Cole Garrison," he said after a moment. "These are my associates, Jack Sullivan and Pete Romero. We're just passing through ourselves." Grace had heard the name Cole Garrison whispered in frightened tones around Redemption. He was rumored to be the leader of one of the most successful outlaw gangs in Texas. Men who robbed banks and trains with audacious skill while somehow avoiding capture by federal marshals. If the rumors were true, she was facing one of the most dangerous men in the territory. But he'd removed his hat when addressing her, and his voice held none of the threat she'd expected from such a reputation. "Grace Morrison," she replied, then immediately regretted sharing her real name. But what was the point of false identity now? Her shame would follow her wherever she went. "Morrison," Cole repeated thoughtfully. "Any relation to the preacher in Redemption?" Heat flooded Grace's cheeks. Even here, in this forgotten corner of nowhere, her father's reputation preceded her. "He was my father," she admitted without the change. In Cole's expression was subtle but unmistakable. Interest sharpened his features as he pieced together, The implications of a preacher's daughter alone in the wilderness with a baby and no visible support. He asked quietly. I am no longer welcome in his house or his congregation, Grace said, lifting her chin with whatever dignity she could muster. I have been cast out for my sins. The three men exchanged glances loaded with meaning Grace couldn't interpret. Jack Sullivan, a red-haired man with kind eyes, shook his head in disgust. Cast out his own daughter, he muttered. Some Christian charity happens more often than you'd think, Pete Romero added, his weathered face grim. Self-righteous men tend to be hardest on their own family when it comes to forgiveness. Cole continued studying Grace, his calculating gaze missing nothing, her obvious breeding, her desperate circumstances, the way she held her baby protectively. Finally, he made a decision that would change everything. You can't stay here, he said matter-of-factly. This shack's too exposed, too close to main travel routes. You and the baby won't last a week. Grace's heart sank. Even these dangerous men were going to abandon her. I understand, she said quietly. I'll move on. Move on where? Cole's voice was practical rather than cruel. You got money for stage. Fair? Friends in Millfield? Family willing to take you in? The questions highlighted the hopelessness of her situation. Grace shook her head, tears threatening despite her efforts to maintain composure. Then you'll come with us, Cole decided. Words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Jack and Pete showed no surprise at their leader's declaration, suggesting they were accustomed to his unpredictable decisions. Grace stared at him in shock. Come with you where? She asked. We maintain a camp about a day's ride north of here. Hidden valley, good water, defensible position. You and the baby will be safe there while you figure out your next move. Grace's mind reeled. The preacher's daughter, traveling with known outlaws? It went against everything she'd been taught about propriety, safety, and moral behavior. But then again, everything she'd been taught had already failed her spectacularly. I can't pay you, she said honestly. I have almost nothing left. Didn't ask for payment, Cole replied. Asked if you wanted to live long enough to give that baby a chance at life. The brutal honesty of his words struck home. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Emma's survival depended on Grace making practical rather than proper choices. Why would you help me? She asked, needing to understand his motivation. Cole was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. Let's just say I've got my own reasons for not trusting self-righteous preachers and the folks who follow them. There was pain in his voice, old wounds carefully hidden but not entirely healed. Grace recognized the sound she was learning to carry similar wounds herself. We leave at first light, Cole continued. Travel light, stay quiet, do exactly what you're told. Can you handle that? Grace looked around the abandoned line shack that had been her first taste of independence. It had taught her that she could survive outside the protective walls of civilization, but it had also shown her the limits of surviving alone. Yes, she said simply. That night, as the three men set up camp outside the shack, Grace marveled at the strange turn her life had taken. 2 days ago, she'd been a disgraced preacher's daughter with nowhere to turn. Now she was preparing to join an outlaw gang in their hidden stronghold. The men were surprisingly considerate, sharing their food without comment and ensuring she and Emma had the warmest sleeping spot. Jack even produced a clean cloth from his saddlebags for the baby's use. Got a sister with young ones, he explained gruffly. Know how it is. As Grace settled Emma for the night, she reflected on the unexpected kindness these dangerous men had shown. They'd offered help without judgment, protection without conditions, acceptance without demands for explanation or penance. Thought it was more Christian charity than she'd received from any actual Christian. Cole appeared in the doorway, his silhouette outlined against the starlit sky. You sure about this, ma'am? Once we ride out tomorrow, there's no going back to your old life. Folks in Redemption hear you've been traveling with my gang. They'll never accept you again." Grace looked down at Emma, sleeping peacefully in her arms despite everything they'd endured. "My old life ended when my father slammed those church doors," she said quietly. "Whatever comes next, it has to be better than what I left behind." Cole nodded, understanding flickering in his dark eyes. "Then welcome to your new life, Grace Morrison. Fair warning, though, it's going to be nothing like what you're used to." As he disappeared back into the night, Grace realized she was no longer afraid of that prospect. The sheltered world that had shaped her first 22 years had offered no mercy when she needed it most. Perhaps it was time to discover what lay beyond the boundaries of respectability. Tomorrow would bring her first ride into outlaw territory, her first step toward becoming someone entirely different from the woman who'd walked out of Redemption. The preacher's daughter was dying, replaced by someone harder, more practical, more willing to embrace uncomfortable truths about survival and loyalty. Emma stirred in her sleep, and Grace kissed her daughter's forehead gently. "We're going to be all right, sweet girl," she whispered. "I don't know how yet, but we're going to make it." Outside, she could hear the men talking quietly around their campfire, planning the next day's journey. For the first time since leaving Redemption, Grace fell asleep without fear, protected by men the world called dangerous, but who had shown her more genuine kindness than any so-called respectable citizen. The transformation had begun. The hidden valley revealed itself like a secret whispered by the earth itself. After 6 hours of riding through increasingly rugged terrain, following game trails that seemed to lead nowhere, Cole Garrison guided his horse through a narrow gap between two towering rock formations. Grace, riding behind him on his sturdy mare with Emma secured in a makeshift sling across her chest, gasped as the passage opened into a verdant sanctuary, hidden from the outside world. The valley stretched before them like something from a fairy tale, its walls rising nearly 300 feet on all sides, creating a natural fortress accessible only through the concealed entrance they'd just navigated. A crystal-clear stream meandered through the center, fed by a waterfall that cascaded down the far cliff face. Cottonwoods and live oaks dotted the landscape, their branches heavy with late summer leaves that rustled in the gentle breeze. But it was the camp itself that truly amazed Grace. This wasn't the rough collection of bedrolls and campfires she'd expected from a gang of outlaws. Instead, she found herself looking at a carefully planned community. Sturdy wooden buildings lined the stream, a main lodge, several smaller cabins, a barn, and what appeared to be workshops. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and she could see people moving about their daily tasks with the purposeful efficiency of a well-organized settlement. "Welcome to Sanctuary," Cole said, noting her amazement. "We've been building this place for 3 years now. Turned out better than any of us expected." As they rode into the camp, Grace noticed the diversity of the people who called this hidden valley home. Yes, there were hard-faced men who clearly lived by gun and horse, but there were also women hanging laundry, children playing by the stream, and elderly folks tending gardens. It looked more like a frontier town than an outlaw hideout. A woman emerged from the main lodge, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. She was perhaps 40, with prematurely gray hair and intelligent green eyes that took in Grace's disheveled appearance with immediate understanding. "Cole Garrison," the woman called out, her voice carrying a slight Irish accent. "What stray have you brought home this time?" Cole dismounted and helped Grace down from the horse, careful of the baby she carried. "Beth, meet Grace Morrison and her daughter Emma. They'll be staying with us for a while." Beth O'Malley, for that's who she was. Grace would learn approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. Her assessment of Grace was thorough but not unkind, taking in the quality of the torn dress, the obvious breeding in Grace's posture, and the desperate exhaustion that shadowed her eyes. "Morrison," Beth repeated thoughtfully. "Any relation to that fire and brimstone preacher down in Redemption?" Grace braced herself for the reaction she'd grown accustomed to. His daughter. Former daughter, she corrected quietly. Instead of judgment, Beth's expression softened with understanding. "Ah, I see. Cast out for this little one, were you?" She gestured gently toward Emma, who was stirring in her sling. Grace nodded, unable to trust her voice. The kind concern in Beth's manner was almost harder to bear than the harsh rejection she'd experienced in Redemption. "Well then," Beth said briskly, "you'll be wanting a bath, a proper meal, and a safe place to rest. Cole, you can explain the situation later. Right now, this girl needs tending." Before Grace could object, she found herself swept into Beth's capable care. The older woman led her to a small but immaculately clean cabin near the stream, chattering about practical matters in a way that required no response from Grace. "This was my daughter's place," Beth explained, opening the door to reveal a cozy interior with a real bed, a washstand, and a stone fireplace. She married young Thompson last spring and moved to his cabin up the ridge. Been keeping it ready for someone who might need it. Grace stood in the doorway, overwhelmed by the unexpected. "Kindness. I can't pay you," she said. The words she'd been forced to repeat so often they'd become automatic. Beth waved dismissively. "Did I ask for payment? Cole brought you here, which means you're under his protection. That makes you family, and family doesn't charge family for basic human decency." The concept of family had been so thoroughly destroyed for Grace that she barely knew how to respond to its casual invocation. In Redemption, family had meant conditional love, rigid expectations, and ultimate betrayal. Here, it seemed to mean something entirely different. Over the next several hours, Grace experienced kindness that defied everything she'd been taught about the nature of good and evil. Beth provided hot water for bathing, clean clothes that had belonged to her daughter, and a meal that was the best Grace had eaten in months. Other women in the camp stopped by to offer baby supplies, practical advice, and simple companionship. "Don't look so surprised," laughed Maria Santos, a young Mexican woman who'd brought cloth diapers and baby clothes. "We take care of each other. Here, learned we have to. The outside world sure doesn't care about folks like us." Grace was beginning to understand that folks like us meant more than just outlaws. The camp housed people who'd been cast out, abandoned, or rejected by respectable society for various reasons. There were women who'd fled abusive husbands, men who'd been blacklisted for standing up to corrupt bosses, families driven from their homes by land grabbers or racial prejudice. "Sanctuary isn't just a name," explained Sarah Mitchell, an elderly woman who'd been a schoolteacher before her husband was killed in a range war. "It's a promise. Everyone here has a story of being thrown away by the world. Cole gives us a place where we can rebuild." As evening approached, Grace found herself sitting by the stream with Emma, watching the sun paint the valley walls in shades of gold and crimson. The baby was content, well-fed, and clean for the first time since they'd left Redemption. Grace herself felt more human than she had in days. "Settling in all right?" Cole's voice came from behind her. Grace turned to find him approaching with 2 cups of coffee, his earlier authoritative demeanor replaced by something more relaxed. In the camp, among his people, he seemed less like the dangerous outlaw of reputation and more like a man carrying heavy responsibilities with quiet competence. "It's not what I expected," Grace admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. "What did you expect?" "Honestly, I thought I was going to be murdered in my sleep or worse." The admission brought a slight smile to Cole's face. "The worst part might still happen," he said with dry humor. "Beth's been known to work people to death with her improvement projects." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the water flow past. Grace found herself studying Cole's profile, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind. There was something about his stillness that invited confidence, a quality she hadn't expected from a man with his reputation. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. Ask away. Why did you help me? Really help me, I mean. You could have just pointed me toward Millfield and wished me luck. Cole was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes distant. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain carefully controlled. Had a sister once. Younger than me, sweet as summer rain. She fell in love with a traveling preacher, much like your James Hartwell, I'd guess. He filled her head with pretty words and promises, then left her with more than just memories. Grace's breath caught. The parallel to her own situation was unmistakable. What happened to her? Our father was a lot like yours, it seems. Threw her out when he learned about the baby. Said she'd disgraced the family name. Cole's jaw tightened with remembered anger. I was away when it happened, working cattle drives to earn money for land. By the time I got back, she was gone. Took me 3 years to track her down. Did you find her? Found her grave, Cole said simply. Her and the baby both. Died of pneumonia in a charity hospital in Galveston. Alone, with nothing but a county burial to show for her 20 years of life. The stark pain in his voice made Grace's heart ache. She understood now why he'd been so quick to help her, why he'd built this sanctuary for society's cast-offs. I'm sorry, she whispered. So am I sorry I wasn't there when she needed me. Sorry I believed the lies about respectability and family honor. Sorry I learned too late that sometimes the people who claim to be righteous are the cruelest of all. Grace felt tears threatening, not just for Cole's lost sister, but for the recognition of her own near miss with that same fate. If not for his intervention, she might well have ended up like that nameless woman in a pauper's grave. Her name was Rebecca, Cole continued. She was going to be a teacher, wanted to help children learn to read. Had more goodness in her little finger than most folks have in their whole bodies. She sounds wonderful. She was. And seeing you with your baby, cast out for the same sin that got her killed, well, let's just say I won't let that happen again if I can help it. The evening air was growing cooler and Emma began to fuss. Cole stood, extending his hand to help Grace up. There's something else you should know, he said as they walked back toward the camp. About the rules here. Grace tensed, waiting for the conditions that would govern her stay. Everyone contributes according to their abilities. We don't keep anyone who won't work for the common good. But we also don't turn away anyone who needs help, and we don't judge people for their past mistakes. What kind of work could I do? Grace asked, practical concerns asserting themselves. Beth says you have good handwriting, probably some education. We could use help with record keeping, correspondence, maybe teaching the children. Or if you're interested in learning other skills, there are plenty of folks here who could teach you. The offer of meaningful work, of purpose beyond mere survival, sparked something in Grace that had been dormant since her exile. In redemption, her only roles had been daughter, potential wife, and disgrace. Here, she might actually be useful for her own abilities. I'd like that, she said softly. Good. Beth will work out the details with you tomorrow. For now, get some rest. You've got a lot of adjusting to do. As they reached her cabin, Cole paused at the door. Grace, what happened to you in redemption? That's not the end of your story. It's just the end of the chapter you didn't write yourself. The next chapter? That's up to you. After he left, Grace sat in her small cabin with Emma sleeping peacefully, in the cradle that had mysteriously appeared while they were by the stream. The baby looked content, safe, surrounded by the kind of caring community Grace had never known existed. For the first time since leaving redemption, Grace allowed herself to hope, not just for survival, but for something more, a life where she could be valued for who she was rather than punished for who she'd been. Cole Garrison had given her that possibility, and she was determined not to waste it. The mysterious outlaw leader had revealed himself to be far more than his reputation suggested. He was a man driven by loyalty, haunted by loss, and committed to creating something better than the harsh world that had failed both him and his sister. And somehow, Grace was now part of that creation. The thought both thrilled and terrified her, but as she drifted off to sleep in her first real bed in weeks, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new relationships to navigate, and new skills to learn. But tonight, for the first time since her world had collapsed, Grace Morrison felt truly safe. And that safety had been provided not by the righteous people of her past, but by the so-called sinners who'd proven themselves capable of grace in ways the church never had. 3 weeks in sanctuary had transformed Grace Morrison in ways she never could have imagined. The soft-spoken preacher's daughter who'd once fainted at the sight of blood was now helping Beth O'Malley tend to knife wounds and bullet grazes with steady hands. The woman who'd never balanced a ledger in her life was managing the complex financial records that kept an entire community fed, armed, and supplied. "You're a natural at this," Beth observed, watching Grace calculate the cost of their latest supply run from detailed receipts. "Got a head for numbers that would make any banker envious." Grace looked up from the ledger spread across the kitchen table in the main lodge, ink stains on her fingers and concentration creasing her brow. "I never knew I had any talent for bookkeeping." In redemption, women weren't expected to handle financial matters. In redemption, women weren't expected to handle much of anything useful, Beth replied dryly. "Here, we can't afford the luxury of keeping half our brains locked away because of what's proper." The truth of that statement had become increasingly clear to Grace as she'd integrated into the camp's daily operations. She discovered abilities she'd never known she possessed, simply because she'd never been allowed to develop them. Her neat handwriting made her invaluable for correspondence with the network of contacts who supplied the camp. Her education allowed her to teach the children whose parents had fled civilization's failures. Her quick mind for details had made her Beth's right hand in managing the countless logistics required to keep 43 people fed, housed, and healthy in their hidden valley. But it was her growing skill at treating injuries that surprised everyone most, including herself. When Tom Rodriguez had been brought in with a bullet in his shoulder after a job gone wrong, Grace had assisted Beth in extracting it without flinching. When little Mary Santos had fallen from a tree and broken her arm, Grace had helped set the bone with the calm competence of someone born to healing. "You've got the touch," Dr. William Hayes had told her. Hayes was a former Army surgeon who'd been drummed out of the service for treating Confederate and Union soldiers with equal dedication. He'd been living in sanctuary for 2 years, serving as the camp's physician and teaching anyone interested in the medical arts. "It's not just about steady hands," Hayes explained as Grace helped him prepare medicines from the herbs they cultivated in the camp's hidden gardens. "It's about seeing people as human beings first, patients second. Too many doctors see illness before they see the person suffering from it." Grace had discovered that her years of visiting the sick and poor in redemption had given her skills she'd never recognized as medical training. She knew how to comfort the frightened, how to recognize signs of fever and infection, how to prepare healing teas from common plants. Under Hayes's guidance, these intuitive abilities were becoming genuine medical knowledge. "I'd like to teach you surgical techniques," Hayes said one afternoon as they worked together in his makeshift clinic. "You've got better instincts than most trained physicians I've known." The offer filled Grace with excitement and terror in equal measure. Surgery was serious business, life and death decisions made with knife and needle. But the thought of being able to truly help people, to save lives rather than just comfort the dying, sparked something deep within her. Her growing competence hadn't gone unnoticed by Cole, who'd taken to stopping by the clinic more frequently than his duties as camp leader strictly required. He'd watch her work with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between pride and concern shadowing his dark eyes. "You're changing," he observed one evening as they sat by the stream, a routine that had developed over the weeks. "Emma, played in the shallow water under their watchful eyes, the 6-month-old baby growing stronger and more alert with each passing day. Is that bad? Grace asked, genuinely uncertain how he felt about her transformation. Not bad, Cole replied thoughtfully. Just different than I expected. When I brought you here, I thought you'd need protection, shelter, time to recover. I didn't expect you to become one of our most valuable assets. Asset, Grace repeated, testing the word. In redemption, she'd been many things: daughter, burden, disappointment, shame, but never an asset. Beth says you've reorganized our entire supply system, made it 20% more efficient. Hayes claims you're a natural healer with better diagnostic instincts than most trained doctors. Even the children are learning faster with your teaching. Methods. I'm just trying to be useful, Grace said, uncomfortable with the praise. Everyone here contributes. I want to earn my place. You've more than earned it, Cole assured her. Question is, what do you want to do with the skills you're developing? The question had been haunting Grace for days. As her abilities grew, so did her awareness of the world beyond Sanctuary's protective walls. There were people out there who needed medical care, children who needed education, communities crying out for the kind of help she was learning to provide. I want to help people, she said finally. Not just here in the camp, but everywhere. There are so many folks who suffer because they can't afford proper medical care or because doctors won't treat them due to their circumstances. Cole nodded slowly. That's what I thought you'd say. It's also what worries me. Why? Because the moment you start helping people outside this valley, you're no longer just Grace Morrison, refugee from respectable society. You become Grace Morrison, associate of the Garrison Gang. That changes how people see you, how they treat you. The harsh reality of his words settled over her like a cold wind. She'd been so focused on developing her abilities that she'd temporarily forgotten the world outside Sanctuary would judge her not just for her past mistakes, but for her current associations. Her introduction to that harsh reality came sooner than expected. A week later, Cole rode into camp with news that would test everything Grace had learned about her new life. There's been an outbreak of diphtheria in Millfield, he announced during the evening meal. Town's got no doctor, and people are dying, mostly children. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Dr. Hayes had been called away to tend to an emergency at another outlaw camp 2 days' ride south. Grace was the only person in Sanctuary with medical training available to help. I have to go, she said quietly, the words coming before she'd fully thought them through. Grace, Beth warned, Millfield isn't exactly friendly territory for our kind, and if they recognize you ... Children are dying, Grace interrupted. I can't sit here with knowledge that could save lives just because it might be dangerous for me. Cole had been watching her during this exchange, his expression unreadable. It's not just dangerous, he said finally. It's potentially catastrophic. If you're captured or killed, it reflects on all of us. We've managed to avoid direct confrontation with the law by being careful about when and how we engage with outside communities. So you're forbidding me to go? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Grace realized she was testing the boundaries of her new life, pushing against the limits of the freedom she'd thought she'd found. Cole studied her for a long moment, taking in her determined expression. The way she held herself with new confidence, the transformation from desperate refugee to capable woman, ready to risk everything for strangers' children. I'm not forbidding you anything, he said quietly. But I am asking you to understand the consequences. For you, for Emma, for everyone here. What if I went alone? Grace asked. Not as part of the gang, just as a woman with medical knowledge, who happened to be passing through. You think they won't recognize Samuel Morrison's daughter? Grace had considered this problem extensively. I'll tell them I'm Grace Mitchell, a widow traveling west. My appearance has changed enough that people might not immediately connect me to the preacher's daughter who was cast out months ago. And if they do recognize you, then I'll face whatever consequences come." Grace's voice was steady despite the fear coursing through her. "But I won't let children die because I was afraid to risk my own safety." The debate continued for hours, with various camp members weighing in on the risks and potential benefits. Some argued that Grace's medical intervention could improve the gang's reputation in the region, making future operations easier. Others worried that exposure could lead to discovery of their hidden sanctuary. In the end, it was Beth who provided the decisive argument. "The girl's right," she said firmly. "We can't call ourselves better than the so-called respectable folks if we're willing to let children die to protect our own comfort. Grace has the skills to help. We should support her doing it." Cole's decision came after another long moment of consideration. "If you're determined to do this, you won't go alone. I'll escort you to the edge of town. Stay close enough to help." "If things go wrong, that's not necessary," Grace protested. "I can handle this myself." "Maybe you can," Cole agreed. "But you don't have to. That's what makes us different from the world that cast you out. We don't abandon our people when they take risks for good reasons." 2 days later, Grace found herself riding toward Millfield with a bag of medical supplies and a heart full of determination mixed with terror. Cole rode beside her, armed and alert, ready to intervene if her mercy mission turned dangerous. "You sure about this?" he asked as the town's buildings came into view. Grace looked down at Emma, riding securely in the sling across her chest. Her daughter deserved to grow up in a world where people helped each other, where medical knowledge was shared freely rather than hoarded by the privileged. "I'm sure," she said, and meant it. What neither of them knew was that word of their approach had already reached certain ears in Millfield, ears belonging to people who remembered Grace Morrison very well indeed, and who had very specific ideas about what should happen to fallen women who dared to show their faces in decent society. The test of Grace's new competence was about to begin, and it would determine not just her own future, but the future of everyone she'd come to love in Sanctuary. The first thing Grace noticed about Millfield was the silence. No children's laughter echoed from the schoolyard. No wives called to each other across garden fences. No sounds of normal daily life drifted from the modest homes lining the dusty main street. Instead, an oppressive quiet hung over the town like a burial shroud, broken only by the occasional sound of muffled sobbing from behind closed doors. Grace adjusted Emma in her arms as she approached the general store, her medical bag heavy against her shoulder. She'd rehearsed her story during the ride from Sanctuary. Grace Mitchell, a widow with medical training, traveling west to join relatives in California. She'd stopped her hair differently, wore a dress borrowed from Beth that changed her silhouette, and hoped that months of outdoor life had altered her appearance enough to avoid immediate recognition. The store owner, a thin man with worried eyes, looked up as she entered. "We're closed, ma'am. Got sickness running through town. Wouldn't recommend staying long." "I heard about the diphtheria outbreak," Grace said calmly. "I have medical training. I'd like to help." The man's expression shifted from wariness to desperate hope. "You're a doctor?" "I've treated diphtheria before," Grace replied carefully, drawing on Dr. Hayes's intensive training over the past weeks. "I know how to manage the symptoms, prevent the spread, and prepare the medications that can help." It wasn't entirely a lie. Hayes had spent hours teaching her about infectious diseases, had walked her through every aspect of diphtheria, treatment from isolation protocols to the preparation of soothing throat remedies. She'd never actually treated a case alone, but she understood the disease better than most frontier physicians. "Tom Bradley," the man introduced himself, extending a shaking hand. "My own boy's been sick 3 days now." Dr. Murphy rode out. "Last week when the epidemic started, said he couldn't risk exposure. We've been managing on our own, but ... How many cases? Grace asked, already mentally cataloging the supplies she'd brought and what additional materials she might need. 14. Confirmed, maybe more. Lost 2 children already, and the Henderson baby's not expected to last the night. Grace felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came with medical emergencies, but also the strange calm that had surprised her during crisis situations in sanctuary. I'll need to see the sickest patients first. Can you take me to the Henderson? Family within minutes. Grace found herself in a cramped cabin where young parents sat vigil over their 18-month-old son. The child's breathing was labored, his throat clearly swollen with the telltale membrane that gave diphtheria its deadly reputation. Grace had seen similar cases in Hayes's medical texts, but facing the reality of a dying baby tested every bit of training she'd received. Mrs. Henderson? Grace approached the exhausted mother gently. I'm Grace Mitchell. I've come to help with the medical situation. Martha Henderson looked up with red-rimmed eyes. Are you a real doctor? Please tell me you're a real doctor. I have medical training, Grace replied, the careful distinction she'd learned from Hayes. I'd like to examine your son, if you'll permit it. The examination confirmed Grace's fears. The baby was in the advanced stages of diphtheria, the membrane in his throat threatening to completely block his airway. Conventional treatment at this stage was often futile, but Hayes had taught her about a desperate measure that sometimes worked, a procedure called tracheotomy that involved cutting a hole in the throat below the obstruction to allow breathing. It was dangerous, requiring precise knowledge of anatomy and steady hands. One mistake could kill the child instantly. But without intervention, the baby would certainly die within hours. I need to speak with you and your husband privately, Grace said quietly. In the kitchen, away from the sick child, Grace explained the situation with brutal honesty. Your son's airway is closing. Without immediate intervention, he won't survive the night. There's a surgical procedure that might save him, but it's risky. You're talking about cutting his throat, James Henderson said, his voice hollow with exhaustion and fear. Yes, it's called a tracheotomy. I'll make a small incision in his windpipe below the blockage, insert a tube to allow him to breathe. If it works, he could recover completely once the infection passes. Martha Henderson gripped her husband's hand. Have you done this before? Grace faced the hardest moment of her new career. Complete honesty might cost the child his only chance at life, but lying went against everything she'd learned about medical ethics from Hayes. I've assisted with the procedure, she said carefully. I understand the anatomy, I have the proper instruments, and I've practiced the technique. But I won't lie to you, this would be my first time performing it independently. The parents exchanged a look heavy with desperation and love. Finally, James Henderson spoke. What are his chances? If you don't try? None, Grace said simply. Then do it. The next hour was the longest of Grace's life. Working by lamplight in the Henderson cabin, with the parents and Tom Bradley assisting, she performed her first independent surgery. Her hands remained steady. As she made the careful incision, located the proper anatomical landmarks, and inserted the breathing tube she'd fashioned from materials in her medical kit. When the baby's breathing suddenly eased and color returned to his lips, Grace felt a profound sense of accomplishment mixed with humbling responsibility. She'd saved a life, but she'd also committed herself to a level of medical practice that would be impossible to hide. He's breathing, Martha Henderson whispered, tears streaming down her face. Oh God, he's breathing normally. Word of the successful procedure spread through Millfield like wildfire. By morning, Grace found herself tending to a steady stream of patients, her improvised clinic in the general store's back room bustling with activity. She treated throat inflammations with herbal gargles, managed fevers with cooling baths and willow bark tea, and set up isolation protocols to prevent further spread of the disease. Her success brought attention she hadn't anticipated. By the second day, People were traveling from neighboring settlements to seek her care. More importantly, her medical competence was beginning to overshadow questions about her identity or background. "Whoever you are, ma'am," said Eleanor Watts, the local schoolteacher whose own throat infection Grace had successfully treated, "you're an answer to prayer." But Grace's growing reputation also attracted unwanted notice. On her third day in Millfield, as she was preparing medications in the store's back room, a familiar voice cut through her concentration like a blade. Well, Grace Morrison. As I live and breathe, Grace's blood turned to ice. Standing in the doorway was Reverend Marcus Whitfield, her father's former colleague and one of the most vindictive men she'd ever known. Whitfield had been visiting Redemption when her disgrace became public, and he'd been among the loudest voices calling for her permanent exile. "Reverend Whitfield," Grace said quietly, continuing to grind herbs with hands that trembled only slightly. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. My name is Grace Mitchell." Whitfield stepped into the room, his pale eyes glittering with malicious satisfaction. "Oh, I don't think so. I'd recognize Samuel Morrison's fallen daughter anywhere. Though I must say, you've certainly found an interesting way to continue your path of deception. I don't know what you mean. Playing doctor? Pretending to heal the sick? How dare you mock God's calling with your sinful presence?" Whitfield's voice rose with righteous indignation. "These good people don't know they're being treated by a woman of ill repute, a mother of bastard child, a creature cast out by her own father for her wickedness." Grace felt the walls of her carefully constructed new identity crumbling around her. But something unexpected happened as Whitfield continued his verbal assault. Instead of shame and panic, she felt anger clean, protective anger for the people. She'd been helping and the child she'd saved. "Are you finished?" she asked calmly, setting down her mortar and pestle. "Finished? I'm just getting started. Wait until I tell these people who you really are, what you've done. Wait until they learn their precious healer is nothing but a what?" Grace interrupted, her voice carrying a steel Whitfield had never heard from the submissive preacher's daughter he remembered. "A woman who saved the Henderson baby's life? A person who's brought the diphtheria outbreak under control? Someone who's asked for nothing in return except the chance to help? You're a sinner, a fallen woman." I'm a healer," Grace said firmly. "Whatever else I may be, whatever mistakes I've made, I'm a person who saves lives." "Can you say the same, Reverend?" The confrontation was interrupted by Tom Bradley's urgent arrival. "Mrs. Mitchell, we need you immediately. Little Jenny Carson's taken a turn for the worse, and her parents are beside themselves." Grace reached for her medical bag without hesitation, but Whitfield blocked her path. "These people deserve to know the truth about you before you touch another patient." "The truth?" Tom Bradley's voice was puzzled, but not hostile. "What truth?" Grace looked at the store owner who'd become her first ally in Millfield, then at Whitfield's expectant face, then at the medical bag that represented everything she'd become in Sanctuary. In that moment, she made a choice that would define the rest of her life. "The truth is that I'm Grace Morrison, daughter of Reverend Samuel Morrison of Redemption. I was cast out of my home and community for bearing a child outside marriage. I've been living in exile ever since." Tom Bradley's eyes widened, but before he could respond, Grace continued. "The truth is also that I've saved 13 lives in this town over the past 3 days. I've brought your diphtheria outbreak under control. I've asked for nothing except the chance to help. Now a child needs medical attention, and I intend to provide it. You can decide afterward whether my past makes my present work worthless." She stepped around Whitfield and headed for the door, her heart hammering but her resolve absolute. Behind her she heard Tom Bradley's voice, quiet but firm. "Reverend, I don't know what kind of Christian charity they practice in your church, but in Millfield, we judge people by their actions, not their circumstances. Mrs. Morrison or Mitchell, or whatever she wants to be called, has earned our respect and gratitude." As Grace hurried toward the Carson cabin, she realized something profound had shifted. For the first time since leaving Redemption, she'd told the complete truth about herself and faced the consequences directly. She'd claimed her identity, her competence, and her right to help others regardless of society's judgment. The crisis had tested not just her medical skills, but her character. And she'd discovered that the woman she'd become in Sanctuary was strong enough to stand up to the world that had cast her out. But as she approached the Carson cabin, Grace also realized that her confrontation with Whitfield was far from over. The vindictive Reverend wouldn't accept this defeat quietly, and her open acknowledgement of her identity would have consequences that extended far beyond Millfield. The test of her character was just beginning. Reverend Marcus Whitfield wasn't a man accustomed to defeat, especially not at the hands of a fallen woman he'd helped cast out of decent society. By dawn of Grace's fourth day in Millfield, he'd spent the night crafting a plan that would destroy her newfound acceptance and restore what he saw as proper moral order. Grace was tending to young Jenny Carson, whose fever had finally broken. After a night of careful monitoring, when Tom Bradley burst into the cabin with urgent news. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, his face tight with worry, "Whitfield's called for a public meeting at the church. Says he's got important information about your character that the whole town needs to hear." Grace's stomach dropped. She'd hoped Whitfield would simply leave Millfield after their confrontation, but she should have known better. Men like him thrived on moral crusades, especially when they could position themselves as protectors of community virtue. "When?" she asked, continuing to check Jenny's pulse even as her mind raced. "1 hour. He sent word to the surrounding settlements too. Claims it's a matter of Christian duty to expose false healers and protect innocent folks from deception." Grace looked down at Jenny Carson, whose color had returned to normal for the first time in days. Around them, the evidence of her medical success was undeniable: children playing again, parents sleeping peacefully, a community returning to health. But she knew that wouldn't matter to Whitfield or the crowd he was assembling. "I have to go," she said quietly. "You don't have to do anything," Tom replied firmly. "Half the town would stand with you against whatever poison Whitfield's planning to spread." "And the other half?" Tom's silence was answer enough. Frontier communities were fragile things, held together by shared beliefs about morality and respectability. Whitfield was offering them a chance to reject someone who challenged those beliefs, to return to the comfortable certainty of judging others by their worst moments rather than their best actions. Grace finished her examination of Jenny, packed her medical supplies, and prepared to face the largest crowd she'd encountered since leaving Redemption. But first, she had something important to do. She found Cole waiting by the horses at the edge of town, exactly where he'd promised to be. His dark eyes took in her expression immediately. "Trouble?" he asked. "The worst kind," Grace replied, then explained Whitfield's planned confrontation. "I need you to take Emma back to Sanctuary." Cole's jaw tightened. "Like hell. If you're facing down a hostile crowd, you're not doing it alone. This isn't your fight, Cole. It's about my past, my choices, my consequences. Emma shouldn't have to witness whatever's about to happen. Emma should see her mother standing up for herself and others," Cole countered. "As for it not being my fight, you became my fight the moment I brought you to Sanctuary. We don't abandon our people." Grace felt a surge of gratitude mixed with fear for his safety. "Whitfield will paint you as a corrupting influence, an outlaw. Who's led me further astray? Your presence could make things worse. Or it could make them better," Cole said simply. "Sometimes people need to see that the so-called respectable folks aren't the only ones capable of loyalty and protection." Before Grace could argue further, they were interrupted by an unexpected arrival. Beth O'Malley rode into view leading 3 other horses, their riders resolving into familiar figures from Sanctuary: Dr. Hayes, who'd returned early from his emergency call; Maria Santos, whose own children Grace had helped care for; and Sarah Mitchell, the former schoolteacher. "Did you really think we'd let you face this alone?" Beth called out, dismounting with characteristic briskness. The entire camp wanted to come, Dr. Hayes added, but we thought a smaller group would make a better impression. Can't have the good people of Millfield thinking they're being invaded by outlaws. Grace stared at her unexpected support system, overwhelmed by their willingness to risk exposure for her sake. You don't understand what this could mean for you, for Sanctuary. If people connect you to the gang, then they'll learn that outlaws show more Christian charity than most Christians. Sarah Mitchell interrupted. I've been a schoolteacher for 20 years, Grace. I know moral courage when I see it, and I know the difference between reputation and character. The group made their way toward Millfield's small church, where a crowd was already gathering. Grace recognized faces from her days treating patients, some friendly, others uncertain, a few openly hostile. But there were also strangers, people who'd traveled from other settlements specifically to witness Whitfield's promised revelation. The church itself was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds spilling onto the front steps and into the dusty yard. Whitfield stood at the pulpit, resplendent in his finest black suit, his pale eyes scanning the assembly with satisfaction. He'd positioned himself perfectly, the righteous minister protecting innocent folks from deception and sin. Friends, Whitfield began, his trained voice carrying easily over the crowd. I come before you today with a heavy heart but a clear conscience. It is my Christian duty to warn you about the woman who's been treating your families, the person you've welcomed into your homes and trusted with your children's lives. A murmur ran through the assembly. Grace felt Cole's reassuring presence beside her, Beth's supportive hand on her shoulder, but she also felt the weight of dozens of eyes fixed on her with growing suspicion. This woman, Whitfield continued, pointing dramatically in Grace's direction, is not who she claims to be. She is not the widow Grace Mitchell, traveling to join family in California. She is Grace Morrison, daughter of my esteemed colleague, Reverend Samuel Morrison of Redemption. She was cast out of that godly community for bearing a child out of wedlock, for bringing shame upon her family and her faith. The crowd's reaction was immediate and mixed. Some gasped in shock, others nodded as if pieces were falling into place. A few called out questions or condemnations. Grace felt her cheeks burn but kept her head high, refusing to show the shame Whitfield expected. But that's not the worst of her deceptions, Whitfield pressed on, building toward his climax. This fallen woman has been living among outlaws and criminals. She's associated with the notorious Garrison Gang, those robbers and murderers who've terrorized honest citizens across Texas. Now the crowd's mood shifted toward genuine alarm. Mothers pulled their children closer, men reached for weapons they might be carrying. Grace felt the collective judgment of the assembly like a physical weight, crushing down on her carefully built new identity. She's used your trust to gather information about your community, your resources, your weaknesses, Whitfield continued. Who knows what intelligence she's passed along to her criminal associates? Who knows what plans they're making against peaceful, God-fearing folk like yourselves? That's enough. The voice that cut through Whitfield's accusations belonged to Dr. Hayes, who stepped forward with the authority that came from decades of medical practice. The crowd quieted, recognizing the gravity in the elderly physician's manner. Reverend Whitfield, Hayes said clearly, I've been practicing medicine for 35 years. I've trained doctors, surgeons, and field medics. I've seen more medical work than any man in this territory. He turned to address the crowd directly. Whatever this woman's past might be, whatever mistakes she may have made, she is one of the most gifted natural healers I've ever encountered. The work she's done in this town over the past 4 days represents medical skill that would credit any trained physician. Pretty words, Whitfield interjected, but they don't change the facts about her character, her associations. Her associations, interrupted Tom Bradley, stepping forward from the crowd, include saving my son's life when he was dying of diphtheria. Her character includes working day and night without rest or payment to bring this epidemic under control. "She saved our Jenny," called out Mrs. Carson from the crowd. "Don't care what her name is or where she comes from, she gave us our daughter back." Other voices began joining in, parents and patients speaking up about Grace's medical care, her gentle manner with frightened children, her refusal to accept payment from families who could barely afford food. The testimonials created a counter-narrative to Whitfield's accusations, but Grace could see the crowd remain divided. It was then that Grace made the decision that would define not just her own future, but her understanding of what it meant to claim a place in the world. She stepped forward, Emma held securely in her arms, and addressed the assembly with a voice that carried clearly despite her fear. "Reverend Whitfield is telling you the truth about my past," she began, silencing the crowd with her directness. "I am Grace Morrison, daughter of Samuel Morrison. I was cast out of redemption for bearing a child outside marriage. I have been living with people society calls outlaws." The admission sent another ripple through the assembly, but Grace pressed on. "What Reverend Whitfield hasn't told you is why I was cast out. I was deceived by a traveling preacher who promised marriage, then abandoned me when I needed him most. When I returned home seeking forgiveness and help, my own father declared me dead to him. The church that had raised me, that I'd served faithfully for 22 years, offered no mercy, no second chance, no Christian charity." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "The outlaws you've been taught to fear took me in when I had nowhere else to go. They fed me when I was hungry, sheltered me when I was homeless, protected me when I was defenseless. They asked for nothing in return except that I contribute to our community according to my abilities." Grace looked directly at Whitfield. "You want to talk about Christian values, Reverend? Those so-called criminals showed me more of Christ's love than any church I'd ever known." "Blasphemy!" Whitfield sputtered. "You dare compare criminal associations to Christian fellowship?" "I compare actions to words," Grace replied calmly. "I compare the people who helped me rebuild my life to the people who tried to destroy it. I compare those who saw potential in me to those who saw only shame." She turned back to the crowd, her voice carrying passionate conviction. "Yes, I've made mistakes. Yes, I've associated with people you've been taught to fear. But I've also spent the past 4 days and nights working to save your children's lives. I've used skills learned from an outlaw doctor to perform surgery that saved the Henderson baby. I've asked for nothing except the chance to help." Martha Henderson suddenly pushed through the crowd, her 18-month-old son in her arms. The child was alert and healthy, breathing normally through the small tube still inserted in his throat. "This woman," Martha said loudly, "gave me back my son. I don't care if she's a preacher's daughter or an outlaw's wife or the devil himself. She saved my baby's life when he was dying." "Medical skill doesn't excuse moral corruption," Whitfield insisted, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Moral corruption?" The new voice belonged to Sarah Mitchell, who stepped forward with the authority of someone who'd spent decades shaping young minds. "I've watched this woman work. I've seen her gentleness with sick children, her compassion for frightened parents, her refusal to accept payment from families who could barely afford food. If that's moral corruption, then we need more of it." The crowd was clearly wavering now, torn between Whitfield's moral absolutism and the evidence of Grace's beneficial actions. It was Cole who provided the final push. "Folks," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of natural leadership, "I'm Cole Garrison. Yes, I'm the man whose name you've heard whispered in frightened tones. I lead a group of people that society has cast out for various reasons." The crowd's tension ratcheted higher at this admission, but Cole continued calmly. "We've never harmed innocent people. We've never taken from those who couldn't afford to lose. We've helped more struggling families than most churches ever will. And we've given Grace Morrison something her own family and community refused to provide, a chance to become the person she was meant to be." He gestured toward Grace, who stood holding Emma with dignity despite everything she'd endured. "You've seen what she can do when given that chance. You've benefited from skills she developed because people believed in her potential rather than condemning her past. The question you have to ask yourselves is simple. What matters more, where someone comes from or what they choose to do with their life?" The silence that followed was broken by Tom Bradley's voice. "I call for a vote," he said loudly. "All in favor of Grace Morrison continuing to provide medical care in Millfield, regardless of her past or associations, say aye." The chorus of ayes that rose from the crowd was strong enough to echo off the church walls. When Bradley called for opposition, only a handful of voices responded, Whitfield's among them. "Motion carries," Bradley announced with satisfaction. "Mrs. Morrison, Millfield would be honored to have you stay as long as you're willing." Grace felt tears threatening as the crowd began to disperse, many people stopping to thank her personally or to ask about follow-up care for their families. She'd faced down the worst kind of public judgment and emerged not just intact, but accepted. But as she watched Whitfield's retreating figure, his face dark with frustrated rage, Grace knew this victory came with a price. She'd publicly associated herself with Cole's gang, claimed her place in their outlaw family, and challenged the moral authority of established religion. There would be consequences beyond Millfield's borders. But for the first time since leaving Redemption, Grace felt no fear of those consequences. She'd found her ground and learned to stand on it. The preacher's daughter was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who would define herself by her choices, not her circumstances. The ride back to Sanctuary felt different than any journey Grace had ever taken. For the first time in her life, she was returning from a victory entirely her own, not granted by others' approval, but earned through her own courage and competence. Emma slept peacefully in the sling across her chest while Grace rode beside. Cole, the late afternoon sun painting the rugged landscape in shades of gold and amber. "You realize what you've done, don't you?" Cole asked as they navigated a narrow canyon that led toward the hidden valley. "Saved some lives, stood up to a bully, made some enemies," Grace replied, though she sensed he meant something deeper. "You've claimed your place in the world," Cole said quietly. "Not asked for it, not begged for it, not tried to earn it through submission or apology. You claimed it." The words settled into Grace's consciousness like seeds finding fertile ground. He was right in Millfield. She'd done something she'd never attempted in Redemption or even in her early days at Sanctuary. She'd refused to accept others' definitions of her worth, had insisted on being judged by her actions rather than her circumstances, had stood firm in claiming her right to help people regardless of society's opinion. It felt ... Grace searched for the right word. Powerful, terrifying but powerful. "That's what freedom feels like," Cole observed. "Scary as hell the first time you really taste it." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, but Grace found herself studying Cole's profile with new awareness. Over the months since he'd found her at the line shack, she'd grown accustomed to his steady presence, his quiet support, his way of offering guidance without trying to control her choices. But today had revealed something more, the depth of his commitment to her success, his willingness to risk his own safety and reputation for her sake. "Cole," she said finally, "why did you expose yourself today? You could have stayed hidden. Let me face Whitfield alone." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice carried an unusual vulnerability. "Because watching you grow into who you were meant to be has been the most remarkable thing I've ever witnessed. And because ... He paused, seeming to wrestle with words. "Because somewhere along the way, your victories became more important to me than my own safety." The admission hung between them like a bridge Grace could choose to cross or leave behind. She felt her heart quicken, recognizing the depth of feeling behind his carefully chosen words. "Cole," she began, then stopped, uncertain how to voice. the complex emotions she'd been carrying for weeks. "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly. "I know your focus has been on rebuilding your life, developing your skills, finding your place. I didn't help you escape one situation where you felt trapped just to create another one." Grace pulled her horse to a stop, forcing Cole to do the same. In the golden light of late afternoon, with the vast Texas landscape stretching around them, she looked directly into his dark eyes. "What if I wanted to create something?" she asked softly. "Not because I felt trapped or desperate or grateful, but because I've found someone whose strength complements mine, whose values align with my own, whose presence makes me want to be the best version of myself." Cole's expression shifted from careful restraint to cautious hope. "Grace, I'm not the same woman you found at that line shack," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "I'm not looking for someone to rescue me or take care of me or make decisions for me. I'm looking for a partner, someone who'll stand beside me when I face down angry crowds, who'll support my medical work even when it's dangerous, who'll help me raise Emma to be strong and independent. And you think I could be that person?" Grace thought about everything she'd observed over the past months: Cole's unwavering support of her education and medical practice, his respect for her growing independence, his willingness to let her make her own choices even when he disagreed, his gentle patience with Emma, his principled leadership of their outlaw community. "I think you already are that person," she said simply. Cole dismounted and approached her horse, reaching up to help her down. When her feet touched the ground, they stood close enough that she could see the emotion he usually kept carefully controlled. "Grace Morrison," he said, his voice rough with feeling, "I've been falling in love with you since the day you insisted on going to Millfield despite the danger. Watching you stand up to Whitfield today, seeing you claim your right to help people regardless of what anyone thought, that's when I knew I was completely lost." "Lost?" Grace smiled, reaching up to touch his weathered cheek. "I'd say you were found. We both were." When he kissed her, it was with the gentle passion of a man who'd waited months to express feelings he'd been careful not to impose. Grace responded with the confidence of a woman who finally understood the difference between settling for security and choosing partnership with someone worthy of her strength. When they finally broke apart, Emma was stirring in her sling, making the soft sounds that indicated she'd be wanting attention soon. "We should get home," Grace said, the word home carrying new weight as she applied it to the place where she'd built a life with people who'd chosen to love her. "Home," Cole agreed, and the way he said it suggested he was thinking about more than just their destination. The reunion at Sanctuary was everything Grace could have hoped for. The entire camp had gathered to hear about the confrontation in Millfield, and news of her victory spread quickly through the community. But it was Beth O'Malley's reaction that meant the most to Grace. "I'm proud of you, girl," Beth said simply, embracing Grace with the fierce affection of a mother. "You've become everything I hoped you could be when Cole first brought you here." "What's that?" "A woman who knows her own worth and won't let anyone convince her otherwise." The celebration that evening felt different from the casual gatherings Grace had attended before. This wasn't just welcome for a refugee or appreciation for medical skills. This was recognition of her as a full member of their community, someone who'd proven herself capable of standing up for their shared values in the outside world. But it was the private conversation with Dr. Hayes that truly illuminated how much had changed. "I have a proposition for you," Hayes said as they sat by the stream after the festivities had wound down. "There's a network of doctors and healers who work with communities that can't afford or access traditional medical care. Frontier towns, mining camps, settlements where people like us end up. People like us? Folks who've been cast out, overlooked, or abandoned by respectable society. They need medical care just as much as anyone else, maybe more. Your performance in Millfield shows you're ready to work independently." Grace felt a thrill of possibility mixed with uncertainty. "You're talking about traveling, setting up practices in different communities?" I'm talking about building something bigger than just treating patients here in Sanctuary. You could train other healers, establish medical stations throughout the territory, create a network of care for people who've been forgotten by the established medical system. The vision Hayes painted was ambitious beyond anything Grace had imagined for herself. It would mean leaving the safety of Sanctuary regularly, facing potential hostility in community after community, taking responsibility for training others, and managing complex logistics. It would also mean doing exactly what she'd discovered she was meant to do, using her medical skills to help people who needed it most. I'd want to discuss it with Cole, she said finally. Whatever I decide would affect us. Hayes smiled. The fact that you see it as a partnership decision, rather than just your own choice, tells me you've learned something important about love and independence coexisting. Later that night, as Grace and Cole sat on the porch of her cabin, with Emma sleeping peacefully inside, she shared Hayes's proposition and found herself articulating dreams she hadn't even known she was forming. I want to do it, she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. I want to build something that helps people like us, people who've been thrown away by the world, but still deserve care and dignity. It would be dangerous, Cole pointed out, but his tone was thoughtful rather than discouraging. Traveling to hostile communities, dealing with people who might recognize you or me, managing the logistics of supplies and training. Yes, it would be dangerous. It would also be the most meaningful work I could possibly do. Cole was quiet for a moment, considering. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of a decision that would shape both their futures. Then we'll make it work, he said simply. We'll figure out how to keep you safe, how to manage the travel, how to build the network Hayes is envisioning. Because you're right, it's the work you were meant to do. Grace felt her heart swell with love for this man who consistently chose to support her growth rather than constrain it. We, she asked, though she already knew the answer. We, Cole confirmed. I'm not letting you face hostile communities alone, and Sanctuary needs to be part of something larger anyway. We've proven that outcasts can build something good together. Maybe it's time to prove we can share that goodness with the wider world. As they sat together in the peaceful evening air, planning a future that would combine love and purpose, individual growth and partnership, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The desperate woman who'd been cast out of redemption had been transformed not through rescue or charity, but through being given the opportunity to discover and develop her own capabilities. Grace, Cole said softly, there's something else I want to ask you. She turned to face him, noting the nervous energy in his posture. I know we've talked about partnership, about building a life together, but I want to make it official. I want to marry you not because you need protection or security, but because I want the world to know that Grace Morrison chose me just as much as I chose her. Grace felt tears of joy threatening as she looked at this remarkable man who'd helped her discover her own strength, then consistently supported her in using it. Yes, she said simply. Yes to marriage, yes to partnership, yes to building something meaningful together. As they kissed under the star-filled Texas sky, with the sounds of their chosen community settling into sleep around them, Grace realized she'd finally found what she'd been seeking all along, not someone to complete her, but someone to complement. The complete person she'd learned to become. The preacher's daughter who'd once believed her worth, depended on others' approval, was gone forever. In her place stood a woman ready to claim love and purpose on her own terms, with a partner worthy of the strength she'd fought so hard to discover. 1 year later, Grace Garrison stood on the steps of what had once been an abandoned church in the settlement of Cedar Ridge, watching as the last of her medical supplies were unloaded from the wagon. The building's transformation over the past 3 months mirrored her own journey. What had been broken and discarded was now being restored to serve a greater purpose than its original design. The surgical theater is ready for your inspection. Dr. Garrison, called Maria Santos, who'd become Grace's most trusted assistant and was now training to be a full medical practitioner. HERSEL, left Dr. Garrison. The title still felt new. Earned through a combination of her field experience, Dr. Hayes's intensive training, and certification from a progressive medical college in California that recognized practical competence over formal classroom education. More importantly, it represented her complete transformation from the desperate woman who'd answered a false letter to someone whose skills were sought throughout the territory. Grace entered the converted church, marveling at how they'd managed to create a fully functional medical facility in such an unlikely space. The main sanctuary now housed examination rooms separated by carefully hung curtains. The former choir loft had become a surgical suite with windows positioned to provide optimal lighting. The basement served as a pharmacy where they prepared medications from both cultivated and wild herbs. But most importantly, the facility was designed to serve everyone who needed care, regardless of their ability to pay, their social standing, or their past mistakes. The sign above the door read simply, "Cedar Ridge Medical Center, all welcome." "The Morrison family is here for their appointment," announced Beth O'Malley, who'd traveled with them to help establish the new clinic. At Grace's questioning look, Beth smiled. "Different Morrisons. Tom Morrison and his wife, Sarah, they run the trading post. Been trying to have children for 7 years." Grace nodded, gathering her examination materials. Fertility treatments had become one of her specialties, combining traditional herbal knowledge with modern medical understanding. She'd successfully helped dozens of couples achieve pregnancies, though each case required careful individual assessment. As she worked with the Morrison couple, explaining treatment options and answering their questions with the quiet confidence that had become her trademark, Grace reflected on how her understanding of healing had evolved. Medicine wasn't just about treating symptoms or curing diseases. It was about restoring hope, providing dignity, and recognizing the inherent worth of every person who sought help. "Dr. Garrison?" Tom Morrison's voice interrupted her thoughts. "My wife and I wanted to thank you for what you're doing here. Setting up a clinic where folks like us can get proper medical care without having to travel 3 days to the territorial capital, it means everything." "We've heard about your other clinics too," Sarah Morrison added. "Word is you've got medical stations from here to the Rio Grande, all staffed by doctors you've trained yourself." Grace smiled, thinking about the network she and Cole had spent the past year building. 7 permanent clinics now operated throughout Texas and New Mexico, each one staffed by healers she'd personally trained and certified. Mobile medical units served the most remote settlements, while a carefully organized supply chain ensured consistent access to medications and surgical instruments. "It's not just my work," Grace replied honestly. "Every clinic is a community effort, supported by local people who believe everyone deserves medical care." What she didn't mention was how the network was funded. Cole's gang had evolved from simple bank robberies to what he called wealth redistribution, taking from corrupt officials, exploitative mine owners, and other targets whose illegal gains could be redirected to serve the communities they'd victimized. It wasn't legal, but it was justice of a sort, and it allowed Grace's medical network to operate without charging fees that would exclude the people who needed help most. After the Morrisons left, Grace found herself alone in the converted sanctuary. For a few quiet moments, sunlight streamed through the restored stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the examination tables where she'd spent the morning treating everything from childhood fevers to mining injuries to birthing complications. "Admiring your handiwork?" Cole's voice came from the doorway, warm with the affection that had only deepened over their year of marriage. Grace turned to see her husband leaning against the doorframe, his dark hair showing new threads of silver, his face bearing the weathered look of a man who spent most of his time outdoors. But his eyes held the same quiet strength that had first made her feel safe when she was at her most vulnerable. Admiring what we've built together, she corrected, moving to embrace him. Cole's arms wrapped around her with the easy familiarity of partners who'd learned to work in perfect harmony. Their marriage had proven to be everything Grace had hoped, a true partnership where her professional growth was not just supported, but actively encouraged, where his outlaw activities were balanced by her healing work, where they'd created something greater than either could have achieved alone. How did the supply run go? Grace asked, noting the dust on his clothes that suggested a long ride. Better than expected. The silver mine operation was even more corrupt than we'd heard. They'd been shortchanging workers' wages while padding their own profits. We redistributed about $3,000, which should keep your clinic supplied for the next 6 months. Grace had long since made peace with the moral complexity of their situation. Cole's targeted thefts from corrupt businesses and officials provided the funding that allowed her to offer free medical care to people who desperately needed it. The money taken from exploitative employers went directly to healing their exploited workers. It wasn't the kind of justice taught in law books, but it was the kind that actually improved people's lives. Any problems? She asked, always worried about the risks Cole took to support her work. Nothing we couldn't handle. Though I did get some interesting news in Millfield. Grace raised an eyebrow. They'd maintained contact with Tom Bradley and other allies in Millfield, but rarely visited in person due to the attention their presence attracted. Reverend Whitfield is gone, Cole continued. Seems his congregation got tired of his mean-spirited preaching and asked him to find another parish. Tom says the new minister is actually preaching about forgiveness and second chances. Grace felt a complex mix of emotions at this news. Whitfield had represented everything she'd learned to reject about conditional Christianity and moral judgment, but his departure felt less like victory than simple irrelevance. She'd moved so far beyond caring about his approval that his absence barely registered. That's good, I suppose, she said finally. I hope his next congregation finds him more helpful than destructive. Cole studied her face with the perceptiveness that came from truly knowing someone. You really have moved beyond all of that, haven't you? The anger, the need to prove them wrong, the desire for their acceptance. Grace considered the question seriously. When had she stopped caring about what the people of redemption thought of her choices? When had their approval become unnecessary for her sense of self-worth? I think it happened gradually, she said. Every life I saved, every student I trained, every clinic we established, each success made their rejection matter less. It's hard to feel ashamed of your choices when you can see the good they've produced. Speaking of students, Cole said, his tone shifting to something that sounded almost nervous. There's something else we should discuss. Before Grace could ask what he meant, the sound of running feet interrupted them. Emma, now walking confidently, at 18 months old, burst into the sanctuary pursued by Jack Sullivan, who'd become her unofficial uncle and favorite playmate. Mama, Mama! Emma called out, launching herself toward Grace with the fearless confidence of a child who'd never doubted she was loved and wanted. Grace scooped up her daughter, marveling at how this beautiful, healthy child had emerged from such desperate circumstances. Emma would grow up in a world very different from the one Grace had known as a child, surrounded by people who valued her for who she was rather than trying to mold her into what they thought she should be. What's this about students? Grace asked Cole while Emma babbled happily in her arms. Cole's nervous expression deepened. Dr. Hayes sent word that he's received inquiries from women-bat East daughters of wealthy families who want to study medicine but can't get accepted to traditional medical schools because of their gender. They're asking if you'd consider taking on formal students, training the next generation of women physicians. Grace felt her breath catch. The idea of establishing a formal medical school, of training women who'd been denied educational opportunities simply because of their sex, represented a natural evolution of everything she'd been building. It would mean expanding our operations significantly, Cole continued. We'd need larger facilities, more supplies, a more structured curriculum. And it would draw even more attention from authorities who already consider our network suspicious. But it would also mean training dozens of women physicians instead of just a few, Grace said, her mind already racing with possibilities. Women who could establish their own clinics, train their own students, expand medical care to communities throughout the West. Cole smiled, recognizing the excitement in her voice that always accompanied a new challenge worth pursuing. I thought you'd see it that way. The question is whether you're ready for that level of responsibility and risk. Grace looked around the converted church, thinking about the network of clinics they'd already established, the lives that had been saved, the communities that had been served. She thought about Emma, who would grow up seeing women as doctors, teachers, and leaders rather than just wives and mothers. She thought about all the women who might benefit from medical training if given the opportunity. I'm ready, she said with the quiet certainty that had become her trademark. But only if we do it right, only if we maintain our commitment to serving everyone, regardless of their ability to pay or their social status. I wouldn't expect anything less from you, Cole replied, pulling both Grace and Emma into his arms. As they held each other in the sanctuary that had been transformed. From abandoned ruin into healing center, Grace reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment. The desperate woman who'd been cast out of redemption for a single mistake had become someone whose influence extended across multiple territories, whose medical network served thousands of people, whose marriage had proven that love and professional ambition could enhance each other rather than compete. Grace, Cole said softly, I want you to know that everything we've built together, everything you've achieved, Rebecca would have been so proud. The mention of Cole's lost sister, whose tragedy had motivated his original rescue of Grace, brought tears to her eyes. In a way, every life Grace saved, every woman she trained, every community she served was a tribute to the woman who died alone because society had offered no mercy for her mistakes. I hope so, Grace whispered. I hope she knows that her story didn't end with her death, that it continued through everyone we've been able to help. That evening, as the new clinic settled into peaceful quiet and their small family prepared for sleep, Grace stepped outside to look up at the star-filled Texas sky. Somewhere out there, in settlements and mining camps in frontier towns, people were receiving medical care from practitioners she'd trained, using techniques she'd taught, supported by a network she'd helped create. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, patients to treat, students to train, a medical school to plan, and the constant work of building something better than what existed before. But tonight, Grace Garrison stood in the certainty of knowing she'd found her purpose and claimed her place in the world on her own terms. The preacher's daughter who'd once measured her worth by others' approval was gone forever, replaced by a woman who defined success by the lives she touched and the positive change she created. She'd learned that true redemption didn't come from seeking forgiveness for past mistakes, but from building a future worth the struggles it took to achieve it. And as she looked up at the vast canopy of stars, Grace knew that the best part of her story was still being written. 5 years had passed since Grace Morrison first stepped off that dusty stage in redemption, clutching her infant daughter and a handful of broken dreams. Now, as Dr. Grace Garrison stood before the largest gathering of medical professionals the American West had ever seen, she marveled at how completely her life had been transformed by choices she'd never imagined herself capable of making. The Grand Medical Convention of 1886 had drawn physicians, surgeons, and healers from across the continent to San Antonio, Texas. What made this gathering unprecedented wasn't just its size, over 300 medical professionals, but its revolutionary inclusivity. For the first time in American history, women physicians were not only welcomed but celebrated as equals, their contributions to frontier medicine recognized and honored. Ladies and gentlemen, Grace began, her voice carrying easily across the packed auditorium. 5 years ago, the Western Territories Medical Network consisted of one abandoned church, 2 untrained assistants, and a desperate hope that medicine could be practiced with compassion rather than profit. A murmur of appreciative laughter rippled through the audience. Many of these doctors had heard stories about the mysterious medical network that appeared in remote settlements, offering expert care to those who could never afford traditional physicians. Fewer knew the remarkable woman who'd built it from nothing. Today, our network encompasses 47 permanent medical facilities, 12 mobile treatment units, and 83 certified practitioners serving communities from the Rio Grande to the Canadian border. More importantly, we've trained over 200 women physicians who are now establishing their own practices throughout the West. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Grace barely heard it. Her attention was focused on the faces in the crowd, women whose lives had been changed by the educational opportunities she'd created, men who'd overcome their prejudices to support female colleagues, frontier families who'd received care when they needed it most. In the front row sat Dr. Maria Santos, who'd progressed from Grace's first assistant to one of the most respected surgeons in New Mexico. Beside her was Dr. Sarah Chun, a Chinese-American woman who'd been denied entry to every medical school in California until Grace's program accepted her. Behind them sat dozens of other women who'd found their calling in medicine despite society's attempts to limit their opportunities. But it was the presence of a small group in the back corner that filled Grace with the most pride. Emma, now 6 years old and already showing signs of her mother's determined intelligence, sat between Cole and Beth O'Malley. Their outlaw family had traveled from their latest base of operations to witness Grace's moment of professional triumph. The principles that guide our network are simple, Grace continued her address. First, medical care is a human right, not a privilege to be purchased. Second, healing comes through understanding and compassion, not judgment and condemnation. Third, the measure of a physician's worth lies not in their background or credentials, but in their ability to preserve and improve life. As she spoke these words, Grace caught sight of a familiar figure entering the auditorium's rear doors. Her breath caught as she recognized Tom Bradley, the store owner from Millfield who'd first defended her against Reverend Whitfield's accusations. Behind him came several other faces from that pivotal confrontation, people who'd chosen to judge her by her actions, rather than her circumstances. Dr. Garrison called out a voice from the audience during the question period that followed her presentation. There are rumors that your medical network receives funding from questionable sources. How do you respond to critics who suggest your clinics are supported by criminal activities? The question Grace had been expecting finally arrived. She'd prepared for this moment, knowing that the truth about Cole's activities would eventually become public knowledge. But she'd also learned that honesty, even uncomfortable honesty, was always more effective than evasion. Dr. Patterson, Grace replied, recognizing the questioner as a prominent physician from Boston. You're correct that our funding sources are unconventional. My husband leads a group that redistributes wealth from corrupt officials and exploitative business owners to the communities they've victimized. Is this legal? No. Is it moral? I believe it is. The auditorium fell silent, shocked by her candid admission. Grace continued, her voice steady and unapologetic. The silver mine in Esperanza was paying workers 50 cents a day while selling their labor to the company for $5 a day. When we redirected their excess profits to fund medical care for those same workers, was that criminal theft or delayed justice? The territorial judge in Bakersfield was accepting bribes to ignore safety violations that killed dozens of miners. When we confiscated his ill-gotten gains to establish a hospital for mining injuries, were we stealing or healing? Dr. Patterson's face reddened with indignation. You're admitting to being part of a criminal organization. I'm admitting to being part of a family that believes in practical justice rather than theoretical morality, Grace replied calmly. I'm admitting that sometimes the law and what's right aren't the same thing. And I'm admitting that I'd rather save lives with questionable money than let people die with clean hands. The silence that followed was broken by unexpected applause. From the back of the auditorium, Tom Bradley had stood up, his weathered hands clapping steadily. 5 years ago, he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the room, Dr. Garrison saved my town from a diphtheria epidemic. She asked for nothing in return, risked her own safety to help strangers, and faced down people who tried to destroy her reputation because of her past. I don't care if her husband robs every corrupt official from here to California. She saved more lives than any physician in this room. Other voices began joining in, testimonials from people whose communities had been served by Grace's network. A woman from a mining camp in Colorado described how Grace had trained the local midwife to handle complicated births. A rancher from New Mexico told of a mobile medical unit that had contained a cholera outbreak. A merchant from Arizona spoke of a clinic that had provided the only medical care available for 300 miles. Dr. Patterson tried to regain control of the discussion. Regardless of the outcomes, we cannot endorse criminal behavior as a funding mechanism for medical practice. The integrity of our profession demands. The integrity of our profession, interrupted Dr. Elena Rodriguez, one of Grace's first students who now directed the Medical Network's training program, demands that we heal the sick, comfort the suffering, and serve those who need us most. Dr. Garrison has done more to advance medical care in underserved communities than any traditional physician I know. The debate that followed revealed the deep divisions within the medical establishment. Traditional physicians argued for maintaining strict legal and social boundaries, while frontier doctors spoke of the realities of practicing medicine in areas where conventional rules didn't apply. But it was the intervention of Dr. William Hayes, now elderly but still commanding respect throughout the medical community, that provided the definitive moment. "Colleagues," he said, rising slowly from his seat with the authority of someone who'd trained more frontier physicians than anyone else alive, "I have observed Dr. Garrison's work for 5 years. I have examined her training methods, inspected her facilities, and reviewed the outcomes of her treatments. Her medical competence is beyond question." Hayes paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "As for her moral character, I would remind you that this is a woman who was cast out by her own family and community for a single mistake, who rebuilt her life through determination and service to others, who has risked her safety repeatedly to provide medical care to those society has forgotten. If that's not Christian virtue, then I don't understand the term." The applause that followed Hayes's endorsement was sustained and widespread. Grace felt tears threatening as she realized that the medical establishment, the very symbol of the respectability she'd once desperately sought, was choosing to accept her, not despite her unconventional path, but because of the good work that path had enabled. When the formal session ended, Grace found herself surrounded by colleagues eager to learn more about her training methods, her network's organization, and her plans for expansion. But the conversation that mattered most took place later that evening, in the hotel room where her Outlaw family had gathered. "I'm proud of you, Grace," Cole said quietly as they sat together while Emma played with wooden blocks Beth had carved for her. "Watching you stand up there, defending our choices, explaining our work to people who've never faced the kind of decisions we deal with, you've become everything I hoped you could be and more. We've become everything we hoped we could be," Grace corrected, taking his hand. "None of this would have been possible without the family that chose to believe in me when I couldn't believe in myself." Beth O'Malley, now graying but still formidable, looked up from her knitting. "The question is, what comes next? You've got the medical establishment's recognition, funding for expansion, more students than you can properly train. What's the next mountain you want to climb?" Grace considered the question while watching Emma carefully stack blocks into increasingly complex structures. Her daughter would grow up in a world where women could be doctors, where healing was valued over judgment, where families could be chosen rather than merely endured. But there were still so many battles to fight, so many communities to serve, so many women to train. "I want to establish a permanent medical college," Grace said finally. "Not just training programs attached to clinics, but a full institution that can grant degrees, conduct research, and train the next generation of physicians, both men and women, to serve underserved communities." "That's a big undertaking," Cole observed. "It would mean building permanent facilities, hiring full-time faculty, dealing with territorial and federal authorities who might not appreciate our methods." "It would also mean legitimizing everything we've built," Grace replied. "Creating something that could outlast all of us, that could continue training healers long after we're gone." The conversation continued late into the night with practical discussions of funding, location, curriculum, and politics. But underlying all the planning was a deeper satisfaction, recognition that they'd succeeded beyond their wildest dreams in creating something meaningful from the ashes of Grace's earlier life. The next morning brought news that would test their commitment to their principles. A messenger arrived with word that Reverend Samuel Morrison, Grace's father, was dying of heart failure in Redemption. He'd sent word asking for his daughter's medical expertise, the same daughter he'd declared dead to him 5 years earlier. "You don't have to go," Cole said immediately. "He forfeited any claim to your care when he cast you out." Grace stared at the message, feeling none of the complex emotion she'd expected. Instead, she felt something simpler and more powerful, the professional obligation that had become central to her identity. "I'm a doctor," she said quietly. "I took an oath to heal the sick, regardless of who they are or what they've done to me. My father is dying, and I have the skills to help him. I have to go." "Then we all go," Beth declared firmly. "You faced down that town once as a desperate refugee. This time, you'll face them as the respected physician you've become." The return to Redemption was everything Grace had anticipated and nothing like she'd expected. The town looked smaller, shabbier, diminished by the wider world she'd come to know. The church where she'd been condemned still stood, but it seemed less imposing, less significant than the medical facility she'd built. Her father's condition was serious, but treatable with the cardiac medications she'd learned to prepare. As she worked to stabilize his heart rhythm and manage his fluid retention, Grace found herself feeling pity rather than anger. Samuel Morrison had aged dramatically, his fire and brimstone certainty replaced by the fragility of approaching mortality. "Grace," he whispered during one of her visits, "I've been wrong about so many things." "Rest now, Father," she replied, checking his pulse with professional detachment. "Save your strength for healing." "I need to say this," he insisted, gripping her hand with surprising strength. "I was wrong to cast you out, wrong to value reputation over love, wrong to let pride and judgment overcome Christian mercy. I've spent 5 years learning that the daughter I rejected has become a better Christian than the preacher who raised her." Grace felt tears threatening but maintained her composure. "I've learned that forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past," she said quietly. "It's about choosing not to let the past define the future. I forgive you, Father, but not because you've asked for it. Because holding on to anger would diminish the person I've chosen to become." Her father recovered enough to attend the ceremony that took place 2 weeks later. The entire town of Redemption had gathered to witness something unprecedented, the official recognition of Dr. Grace Garrison as the first licensed female physician in the territory, with authority to practice medicine and train other physicians throughout the American West. But the moment that meant the most to Grace wasn't the presentation of her official credentials or the speeches from territorial officials. It was watching Emma play with other children in the churchyard, accepted and welcomed by the same community that had once rejected her mother. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Grace found herself standing in the exact spot where she'd been cast out 5 years earlier. But this time, she wasn't alone and desperate. She was surrounded by family, colleagues, and community members who valued her for who she'd become, rather than judging her for who she'd been. Quite a journey, Cole observed, joining her as she looked up at the church steeple that had once represented everything she'd lost. "The best journeys are the ones you never could have imagined taking," Grace replied, watching Emma run toward them with the fearless confidence of a child who'd never doubted she was loved as they prepared to leave redemption for the final time. Grace realized that her transformation was complete. She'd evolved from someone seeking redemption through others, forgiveness, to someone who created redemption through her own choices and actions. The preacher's daughter, who'd once measured her worth by others' approval, had become a woman who defined success by the positive impact she had on the world. The outlaw leader who'd rescued her had become the partner who'd helped her discover that salvation didn't come from being saved. It came from choosing to save others. And the abandoned church where their love story had begun would soon become the site of the Western Territories Medical College, where the next generation of healers would learn that the greatest redemption comes not from seeking forgiveness for past mistakes, but from dedicating your life to ensuring that others don't have to suffer as you once did, as their wagon rolled away from redemption toward the future they would build together. Grace Morrison Garrison knew that the best chapter of her story was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.